Today, I'm going to be telling you two true crime stories that are connected by a single theme. Both of these stories look like they're going one way, only for there to be a particularly awful twist. My name is Nigel, and as always, if you find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime stories told to you with a mysterious vibe. And if you'd specifically like to see more cases like these, be sure to let us know that as well in the comments section below. With that out of the way, let's dive in. Going into the spring of 2007, Charlene Masterson was a normal teenager. She had just celebrated her 18th birthday, she had a large group of friends who she adored, and she was studying hard at school. In fact, normal is a word that could describe most of Charlene's life up until that point. She had been born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, specifically in the southwestern suburb of Tallaght. She was the only child of two hardworking and supportive parents, and by all accounts, they were a loving and happy family. Growing up, Charlene had always done well in school. She was a good student, and overall, just a good kid. Like, to a fault, arguably. You know those kids that are so afraid of getting in any kind of trouble that they follow every rule to a T? That was Charlene. Not in like a bad way, though. It worked for her. She liked to stay busy, and between academics and her many extracurricular activities, it meant that Charlene always had something going on. Now, at the age of 18, it felt like Charlene was well on her way to a good start in her adult life. She was in college working on a degree in science, she had a part-time job, and she was enjoying where she was at. The future seemed equally bright. She figured that at this rate, by the time she was 30, she'd have it all figured out. She'd have a career, she'd be married, and maybe she'd even have children. Sadly, that's not what happened, though. Instead, Charlene's entire life was about to be completely turned on its head. Even stranger was how it all started, with a single text message. The text message was from a number that Charlene didn't recognize, and it was as short as it was ominous. It said simply, "I know what you did." At first, Charlene tried her best to ignore the message. She didn't know who this person was that was contacting her, and she didn't think that she had done anything wrong. But being the person she was, Charlene had a hard time putting the situation out of her mind. She hated the idea that she might be in trouble, and the more she thought about it, the more she started to doubt herself. She began to wonder, did I do something and just forget about it? What does this stranger know? These thoughts continued to eat away at Charlene until she decided that she had to figure out what was going on. She convinced herself that if she just messaged back, she'd be able to get to the bottom of this. After all, whatever it was, she hadn't done it on purpose, and she should be able to fix it. She texted back, asking, "What do you mean?" The stranger replied to Charlene incredibly quickly, but they made it clear that this wasn't any sort of joke or misunderstanding. They claimed they had incriminating information about her, stuff she'd shared in online chats with teenage boys. What was worse, the stranger planned to use this information to destroy her and her family's lives. Specifically, the stranger said that they'd figured out who Charlene's father was, David Masterson. They knew where he worked and who his employer was, and they planned to leak all of Charlene's online activities to his boss and his company. They insisted that once they saw what Charlene was up to, her dad would lose his job and he'd never be able to find work again. As you might imagine, this was Charlene's worst nightmare. She was racking her brain, trying to think back to what dirt this person could possibly have on her, but she couldn't think of anything. Still, it was clear that the stranger was serious. They knew details about her and her family's personal lives and seemed more than capable of delivering on their threats. Charlene begged them to stop and asked, why are you doing this? The stranger responded that they would stop and would not release what they had, but only if Charlene followed instructions and gave them what they wanted. What they wanted was even more horrifying, though. They told her that she would have to engage in sexual acts with them and whoever else they said. At this point, Charlene had no idea what to do. She was terrified and couldn't believe what was happening to her, but she figured the one person who might know what was going on was her father. After all, he was being threatened as well, so maybe he'd know why this person was after them or even their identity. But when Charlene explained the situation to her dad, David, he said he also had no idea who the stranger was. He wasn't able to offer her much comfort either. He could not afford to lose his job. Without his income, their family would be in a desperate financial situation. For this same reason, they also couldn't risk going to the police. If the stranger really did have the blackmail they said and released it, they could end up losing everything. David said he couldn't see any other way. They would have to comply with the demands, at least until they could come up with a way out. Charlene was shocked to hear this, but she also didn't want to be the reason that her family was ruined, especially because she was the one that was responsible. This was all happening because of something she had done. Over the following days, Charlene exchanged more messages with the stranger, who gave her detailed instructions about what would happen next. They said that a man would come to her house at a designated time. When he arrived, she was required to be in a certain room wearing a blindfold and headphones. When the man entered, the music would be turned on, and she was to go along with whatever demands were made. Everything was planned in advance, down to the clothing the stranger wanted her to wear. When the day finally came, Charlene was beyond petrified. The only bit of reassurance she had was that she wouldn't be entirely alone. Her dad said that he would stay in the house in another room. He may not have been able to prevent this from happening, but he was going to try and keep her safe the best he could. As Charlene sat blindfolded in the bedroom that day, David waited with her. When the man that the stranger had told them about arrived, David left the room, went downstairs, and let him in. Charlene was then sexually assaulted by the unknown man, who left immediately afterwards. When it was finished, Charlene waited as instructed before taking off the blindfold and the headphones. As you might imagine, the experience was incredibly traumatizing, though initially she had some hope that the nightmare was over. She figured the stranger had gotten what they wanted, so now they had to leave her and her family alone. But that wasn't the case. If anything, the stranger seemed emboldened by their success. They continued to blackmail Charlene, and the horrifying sexual assault sessions happened again and again. Charlene felt completely powerless to stop what was going on. And from her perspective, she had tried everything. Reasoning with this person, trying to give them what they wanted. After one of the incidents, her dad had even followed the perpetrator and attacked him. He said he figured that the man that was being sent over had to be the stranger himself, and that he believed he'd leave them alone from now on. Instead, though, things only escalated. The stranger became more demanding than ever, and sometimes they'd send two men to assault Charlene at the same time. This continued for more than 2 years, all the while Charlene had to go on with her life as if nothing was happening. She worried that if she didn't keep attending school and work, that the stranger would figure this out and would release the blackmail. Still, all this time she kept wondering who was doing this to her and why. Well, fast forward to one day in 2009, when Charlene was off from college for the summer holidays. This particular day, she didn't have a whole lot going on, and as she was hanging around the house, she saw a laptop that she knew belonged to her grandmother. Charlene remembered her dad telling her that he needed to install some new software on the computer for her grandmother, so to be helpful, she decided to save her dad some time and do it for him while he was at work. She grabbed this bundle of CDs that were sitting in a package and opened it up to start figuring out what to put in first. As she was doing this, Charlene noticed that there were a couple of DVDs mixed into the bundle. There was something scribbled on them with a marker, but she couldn't really tell what it was. So out of curiosity, she decided to pop one of them into the laptop. When she did, she saw that the DVDs had a whole bunch of files on them. She opened the first one and couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was a video recording of the very first assault against her. Not only that, but the unknown man who had abused her was actually her father. Now, Charlene was absolutely devastated. She had never for a second thought that her dad would be capable of something like this. especially because throughout this, he had pretended to be her protector. But the stranger wasn't a stranger at all. David had been behind everything. As Charlene thought about it, all of the pieces started coming together. Her dad pretending to beat up the perpetrator, him walking the men in and out of the house, the blindfolds. It had all been part of an elaborate act. Even the blackmail. From the beginning, a part of Charlene deep down was aware that she'd never done anything wrong. But her dad knew she couldn't stand the idea of being in trouble. He also knew that she'd do anything if she thought she was protecting him and their family. If there was any remaining doubt about all of this, that went out the window when Charlene waited for David to come home that afternoon. When he did, she texted the stranger's number saying, "I know you're my dad." Immediately, David began screaming and yelling from upstairs. But unfortunately, this is not the end of the story. Not even close. You see, David denied doing anything and turned Charlene's confrontation back on her. How could she possibly think he'd done something like this? How could she accuse her own father of something so sick? He treated her like she was crazy, that she hadn't seen what she'd seen, and that nothing bad had happened to her. Despite David's denials, after this, there were no more texts from the stranger. From that point on, he continued the awful abuse, but he did it without any pretense that some other shadowy person was responsible. What was even worse, things escalated significantly. In addition to the sexual abuse, David would physically assault Charlene. The level of psychological manipulation and control also ramped up, with David demanding that she be available to him at all times. He forced Charlene to be tethered to her cell phone constantly. He would send her texts at all hours of the day, would show up unannounced at her work and school, and would harass her anytime she tried to leave the house to see her friends. I mentioned that during the previous 2 years, Charlene had tried to sort of keep going on with her life as normal. Now, obviously, this would have been unimaginably difficult, but in a messed up way, it did sort of provide her with a temporary escape. However, as David took over more and more of Charlene's life, she was forced to give up many of these things. She left her job, stopped going out and doing her usual hobbies, and just generally retreated into herself. Unbelievably, this would go on for another 5 years, until finally in 2014, a very close friend of Charlene's, who happened to be a social worker, started recognizing the signs. She could tell that something was seriously wrong, and she began to try to get it out of her. Even so, it was difficult. By this point, Charlene had long since been broken down psychologically. It was like she was living in this lonely box, and she had been convinced that no one would believe her if she came forward about what was happening. It took months, but her friend was persistent. Finally, Charlene admitted what her father had been doing to her. A couple of Charlene's friends went to her mom, who immediately kicked David out of the house. Now, you might have been wondering already, where was Charlene's mom in all of this? Well, that's another devastating part of this story. She had no idea what was going on. I should say, Charlene has made it very clear in interviews that this was not due to denial or obliviousness on her mom's part. She had noticed things like the fact that David was texting Charlene and calling her constantly, and she spoke to him about this multiple times. But David would always deny that anything was going on, and afterwards he would threaten Charlene to make sure that she kept everything quiet. According to her, the last time her mom asked her dad about the texting, she was awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning to find David face to face with her. He told her, quote, "Did you really think that was going to stop me?" I think Charlene summed it up best when she said in an interview, quote, "If my mom had been in our family home for 23 hours out of 24 hours of the day, he'd have gotten to me in that hour. This is what these types of people do. They will get to you no matter what." Anyway, even after Charlene came out about the abuse to her friends and her mom, she still waited quite a while before going to the police. It seems that part of this was that she needed time to even begin to wrap her head around what the last 7 years of her life had been. But additionally, she still had doubts as to whether she'd be believed. Well, police did believe Charlene, especially when they discovered that, heartbreakingly, she wasn't David's only victim. He would go on to sexually abuse 3 other teenage girls by the time he was arrested for the crimes he'd committed against her. At least one of these girls was a minor. By the time the entire thing made its way through the court system, it was the middle of 2021. David Masterson agreed to plead guilty to numerous charges for the heinous crimes and was sentenced to 18 years in prison, with 1 year suspended. He apparently never showed any remorse for what he had done, and never even attempted to apologize to Charlene for all of the unimaginable pain and trauma he'd put her through. As for the other perpetrators that David included in his daughter's abuse, almost nothing has been released about them publicly. Apparently, David only ever provided one name to authorities, but did say that this person knew Charlene was his daughter when they participated. One other sort of loose end that I wanted to mention was about how David waited until Charlene was 18 before he began assaulting her. I wasn't lying before when I said that by all accounts, Charlene had a normal childhood. At least, that's how she viewed it at the time. It was only later, when she went back and thought about everything retrospectively, that she realized David had actually been exhibiting forms of control and manipulation long before. In short, he was grooming her. Charlene has said that she doesn't know why he operated this way, but she thinks David believed for some reason that once she was an adult, he was somehow legally untouchable. The final thing I wanted to touch on is the incredible bravery of Charlene throughout this whole process. Not only with how she went through this nightmare and somehow came out on the other side, but because the reason we know any of this in the first place is she waived her right to anonymity. She did this not only so that David's name could also be released publicly, but so that other victims might have the courage to come forward. To this end, Charlene has continued to be a voice for survivors, sharing her story with the media, and also working with nonprofits and government organizations that provide resources to people in similar situations. These days, she is also trying to make up for lost time. While she says she doesn't know if she'll ever be able to marry or have children, she's living the best way she knows how. She's got a good career, has reconnected with friends, and has gone back to pursuing the hobbies and things in life that make her happy. If you're interested in hearing more about Charlene's story, we've left links to some of her interviews in the comments section below. In the spring of 2024, representatives from the West Virginia State Police made a surprise announcement to the public. They had a major update in a mysterious missing persons case, one that up until recently had been stagnant for many years. Now, the reason there was movement in the case after all this time was because of a confession, one that authorities never imagined they would get. However, even more shocking than the confession itself was what it revealed. You see, investigators had been wrong about this whole situation from the very start. In order to understand why, though, and exactly what it was police were now revealing, we have to go back to the beginning. Rick Lafferty met Susan Carter one day in the middle of 1985. It was a chance encounter. At the time, Rick was a truck driver in West Virginia, and Susan was the divorced mother of a young daughter. The two felt an instant attraction to one another. They became a couple very quickly, and not long after, they also moved in together. Unfortunately, though, this is not a love story. At least, not in the traditional sense. You see, while Rick and Susan did have some good times together, they also had a lot of problems. Problems that were only made more difficult by the fact that Susan struggled with a lot of mental health issues. She was diagnosed with both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and the conditions were apparently bad enough that she couldn't work. That being said, Susan also often refused to take her medication, something which greatly contributed to the severity of her symptoms. In interviews we came across, Rick described it as like Susan being 5 different people all at once. Sometimes she was amazing, and other times she was terrible, and you never had any way of knowing who you were going to get. Despite the challenges in their relationship, Susan and Rick were together on and off for about the next 10 years. A big reason for that was their daughter, Natasha, who was born at the end of 1989. Just a heads up, I'm going to refer to Natasha as Alex for the rest of this. Alex was her middle name, and it was the one that she most often went by. Anyway, for a long time, the family tried to make things work. Particularly Rick, who not only supported everyone financially, but was also the one who primarily took care of Alex. But eventually the situation became too much for him. You see, on top of Susan's mental health issues, or perhaps because of them, depending on how you look at it, she engaged in a lot of self-destructive behaviors. She got involved in drugs and was constantly unfaithful to Rick. In 1995, he called things off for good. The final straw was when Rick found out that Susan was having an affair with their landlord, a man named Larry Webb. Susan would go on to marry Larry a couple of years later and move in with him at his home in the city of Beckley. Rick, meanwhile, moved to his own place, taking Alex with him. For the next several years, this actually seemed like the most positive thing that could have happened for everyone. Alex was the best thing in Rick's life, and he loved being a father. In interviews we came across, he described her as the best child any parent could have. From the time she was small, she was mature beyond her years, and the way she carried herself, it was like she was a little lady. According to family members, Alex absolutely adored her father. She went everywhere with him, even regularly attending some of his classes with him when Rick was enrolled in college. In the meantime, Susan and Larry seemed perfectly happy to do their own thing. Susan would still see Alex occasionally, but she spent the vast majority of her time with Rick. That's why Rick was caught completely off guard when he went to pick up Alex from school one afternoon, and he was met by the local sheriff and 3 deputies. Rick was told that Susan now had a court order granting her custody of Alex. Part of that order said that he wasn't supposed to have contact with either Susan or his daughter. He wasn't shown any paperwork, but was told to leave, and that they were there to make sure that he didn't cause a scene. Now, as you might imagine, Rick couldn't believe what was happening. By now, he had been taking care of Alex for nearly 5 years on his own, and there hadn't been any issues. How could a court have ordered for his daughter to suddenly be taken away from him? Unfortunately, this is where things get a bit murky. All we really have to go on here is Rick's version of events, but according to him, there actually was no court order. At least, not one that stated Alex should be taken from him and put into Susan's custody. Instead, Susan had applied for custody, but all that had happened is that a judge ruled that the case would be heard in court. In interviews, Rick stated the police department helped Susan because the sheriff and some of the officers that worked there were close personal friends of hers. Anyway, despite this and the fact that Alex made it very clear that she did not want to be with her mother, the whole thing had to work its way through the court system. And during that time, Alex would have to spend most of her time with Susan. As frustrating as this was, Rick was more than willing to fight for his daughter, and he felt that given the difference between his and Susan's track records as parents, it would only be a matter of time before things went his way. It seemed like Susan could sense this too, as she became more and more aggressive during the custody dispute. During one particularly heated session, she told Rick that he'd never see his daughter again. Initially, Rick didn't think much of this. After all, it wasn't uncommon for Susan to lash out like this. However, little did he know, this time would be different. The timeline is a bit fuzzy and inconsistent in reports here, but what we do know is that sometime between February and August of 2000, Rick called to do a routine check-in on Alex. When he did, he got some alarming news. Larry told Rick that Susan had taken Alex and gone off somewhere. He had no idea where they were, though. Larry explained that at first he wasn't worried because Susan did stuff like this all the time. She had been cheating on him a bunch as well by this point, so it wasn't unusual for her to disappear. But by now it had been several days. The only thing he could say for sure is that when Susan and Alex left, they were with a man named either Jose or Manuel. Rick contacted the police, but from the sounds of it, things were not taken very seriously. Despite the fact that Alex was just 10 years old, local authorities treated the situation as more drama in the ongoing custody dispute and figured that Susan would be back sooner rather than later. It wasn't until the fall of that year, when Rick went to another police department, that things started to change. When they heard what was going on, they opened up an investigation, and a felony kidnapping warrant was put out for Susan. But By this point, months had passed, and no trace of either Alex or Susan could be found. The case would eventually be handed over to the Virginia State Police and the FBI, but they didn't have much luck either. Pretty soon, months turned into years. It seemed that wherever Susan Carter had gone, she'd managed to get away with the crime. Things would remain this way for more than 20 years, until Alex's kidnapping was included in a renewed initiative by the U.S. Marshal Service to look at cold cases involving missing children. As part of this initiative, a reward of $10,000 and then $20,000 was put out. This was accompanied by age-progressed photos of both Alex and Susan in the hopes that members of the public might recognize them. Frustratingly, this would once again result in no real further leads on the women's whereabouts. Only this time, authorities would finally start to understand why. In the fall of 2023, so more than 23 years after Alex and Susan had disappeared, police announced that they had obtained a search warrant related to the case. That search warrant was for a property in Beckley, West Virginia, back where all of this originally began. At the time, authorities kept things pretty tight-lidded in terms of what they were doing there. However, media were allowed into the house by a man named Terry Lilly after police left. Terry showed reporters where a section of drywall and some tile flooring had been removed inside the residence. Now, Terry Lilly did not own the property, but he was the caretaker for the man who did. That man was Larry Webb, Susan Carter's husband and Alex's stepfather at the time of the disappearances. As I hinted at the beginning of this segment, the full explanation about what had happened wouldn't come out until the spring of 2024. But when it did, everyone was stunned. It turned out that Susan Carter had never actually kidnapped her daughter. Both of them had been dead this entire time. Larry, who by this point had been arrested in connection with the case, finally agreed to confess to what had happened in April. He told investigators that he had killed Susan all the way back in 2000 during an argument over money. He thought Susan had stolen cash from him, and in a rage, he snapped and murdered her. Horrifyingly, once she was dead, he decided that he had to kill Alex too to try and cover up the crime. He fatally shot the defenseless 10-year-old in her bedroom. This is why police had removed that section of drywall in 2023. They had been able to recover a bullet that had Alex's DNA on it. After committing the double murder, Larry said he had kept Susan and Alex's bodies in his basement for 2 days before finally burying them in the woods on his property. He said that he, quote, knew he had ruined his life forever after the killings. Though, if you ask me, this is hard to believe, considering when he chose to make his confession. You see, Larry was now in his 80s, and he was literally on his deathbed. In other words, he lived the rest of his life letting Susan and Alex's families believe that Susan had kidnapped her daughter and run away. With the information that Larry provided, police were finally able to locate Susan and Alex's remains. Larry Webb died that exact same day, within hours of the bodies being located. While this case may have had a truly devastating ending, it does seem like finally having answers after all these years has brought some semblance of closure for Rick Lafferty. In a statement following the news of the break in the case last year, he said, quote, kind of a sad day, but also a happy day because I can bring my baby home. I want to end with some more of Rick's words here, because I think they're not only a testament to the love he has for his daughter, but also of the immense strength he exhibited through such an unimaginably awful situation. Quote, 24 years. This case went cold so many times, I almost lost hope several times. If I could tell anyone in my position, just never give up hope of finding your child.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.